and welcome to this podcast, Feel Inside Yourself. My name is Ulla Goldberg. I'm a host of this podcast and I'm a coach and mentor from Germany. I help people to create a life with ease, with more serenity, with a positive mindset. And this podcast is here for you to raise your awareness, to become more mindful, and to just find peace and security within you. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this new podcast episode. It's the first interview of 2022, and I have a very special guest with me. It's Dr. Dan Tomasulo, and he is the academic director at the Spirituality Mind-Body Institute. He's also a psychologist, and he is teaching at the Columbia University. And I talked to him about two very interesting topics. One is spirituality, how he lives it, what it is for him. And the other one is hopefulness. Dan is an expert in the topic of hopefulness. And in these times, I think we can all need some hopefulness or some hope. And he will give us some practical tips and ideas how we can bring more hopefulness into our lives. And this was a very inspiring interview for me. We talked about an hour, but I decided not to split it in two parts. I think you're old enough. If you need a break, you just hit pause and then you can continue whenever you feel like it. I think this interview is so interesting that you want to listen to it anyways. So I hope you will have a lot of fun, and of course, we'll be happy to get some feedback from you about this interview, and let's get started. Hello and welcome, Dan, to my podcast today, to this show. Thank you very much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And so let's start off. Where are you in the world right now?
I am in New York City right now, and it is snowing in New York City. So it gives the city this very mystical sort of, you're in a snow globe kind of thing.
Very nice. Yeah, I just told you before, I love New York City. It's like my favorite city. So I'm very grateful I get some New York vibes today.
Yes, yeah, you get some. It's really been lovely here, but now with the COVID, everybody is doing fine. They're trying to manage it, and the university is making some adjustments. But it's really beautiful, really beautiful today.
Cool, that sounds great. I would like to talk to you about two different things today. The one topic is spirituality, and the other one is how helpful it is to learn to be hopeful. And I think in these times, we can all use some hopefulness. And so
Absolutely.
I also want to talk about that. So what is spirituality for you?
I think that the best way to describe it is that it's having a personal relationship with the transcendent, that there's a connection to something much greater than you, that isn't fully understandable, but you believe that your life is being influenced and perhaps guided by it. And from the many people I've spoken with and things that I've read, that seems to be a universal appreciation. It certainly is in my life.
Yeah, that's true. That sounds good. How do you live it in your everyday life? Like, is it also that you let yourself be guided a little bit, that you ask questions to the universe or God or whatever, your higher self, what you want to call it? Or how do you live it in your everyday life?
Well, I firmly believe that each of us has a piece of the divine inside us. And that the degree to which we can access it and have a sense of connection to that piece allows us to both have a personal resource and a collective resource. Yeah, I really do believe in the idea that we're different points of light, but we're all one entity. And until we get that connection inside, it's hard to make the connection outside. So this strive for wholeness is something that first has to do with that understanding that it's not out there so much as it's in here. And once you start that conversation, really, it's like developing a really intimate, close friendship connection. And I have that conversation every day with my higher self or my soul. And I'm often, I spend a lot of time in that space, and I'm often stunned by the fact that he doesn't agree with me. Or has a perspective that I hadn't thought about. I think that's the richest way for people to understand this, that you're having a genuine dialogue with something that is non-local. It's not you. And yet it's an evolved aspect of you. So once you appreciate that, then it's really interesting. It's like running an idea or a question by your best friend is the person that runs the universe, right? So
Yeah.
so it's really a lovely thing to develop that relationship, and then take the time to respond to it and listen to it.
Thank you. I totally agree with you that it's something inside of us. And I also like that you give this perspective that it's not like something outside of you that tells you what is wrong or right, but it's something within you. And I really like that because then it comes back to feel inside yourself. Everything is already within you. And then maybe it's even easier to start that connection if you know it's something inside you that you can feel inside. Very nice.
I know you have my background, but a lot of the work that I do is on developing interventions from positive psychology and spirituality. And being at Columbia for the last several years, most of the courses I teach are highly experiential. Of course, there's all the academic stuff and the readings and whatever, but many of the interventions are designed to help people understand how to access this part of you. And I use a method known as embodied cognition in order to help evolve this relationship. And it's drawn largely from psychodrama, sociodrama, drama therapy, where there is an empty chair where you begin this conversation. And so very often in my classes, we start with the creation of what's called the benevolent self. It's a way to facilitate self-compassion. And so I'll have students sit across from an empty chair, and I'll encourage them to think of all the people that they've experienced kindness with in their life. And rather than have one person sit in that chair, they create an amalgam of all the different feelings of kindness that they've gained from people in their life. And then they create an entity that sits in that chair and sees them through the eyes of benevolence. So they begin this dialogue of connection to a compassionate self. And it's an aspect of them that's been forged from the outside, but now lives inside. So it's this inner dialogue begins. So very often before we jump to having a dialogue with your soul, we start with a compassionate self. And over the years, the students have systematically said that that's been one of the more powerful exercises, because they learned that if you're going to have compassion for others, it has to begin by having compassion for yourself.
That's so true. Could I do this exercise by myself, or would you say I need somebody who moderates it for me at first? Or could I say like, okay, tomorrow morning I'll try, you can see a chair behind me here. I'll sit, like let them, those people sit in that chair and see what comes up?
Yeah, one of the more beautiful things about using embodied cognition in this way is that it extends a lot of the traditional Jungian work on active imagination. It takes some of the work that Moreno did on what's called axiodrama and spiritual connection, and everything that we know about that is that there's a sort of an internal governor. So you're not going to do something in those kind of role plays that makes it dangerous or something. And by the way, if something did happen, if you were doing a role play by yourself, all you have to do is stop. I mean, that's the beautiful part here is that there's nothing driving or pushing it. It's an allowance. It's an engagement. And so actually, I have a 2-minute video that is on the homepage of my my website that I always encourage people to go and do. And it's just a whiteboard, little cartoon kind of thing to show people how to do it. And it's super simple. You put the empty chair across from you, and you really take a moment in a type of contemplation where you think of what would it feel like to have this benevolent self sit across from you? What would it feel like to have somebody who has your best interest at heart, that loves you, cares about you, is willing enough to challenge you if needed, supports you, nurtures you, but only has your best interest at heart? And to start there, where this empty chair becomes filled with a type of essence of compassion. And you start in that place. And then as you feel that presence, you allow a question to bubble up inside of you. And sometimes the question is just a one-off question. And sometimes they're very deep and philosophical and meaningful, but people will start that questioning and they'll say, I feel a little lost today, and I'm not sure what the next right thing is to do. Can you help me? And then you literally have to reverse roles. That's the most important thing with this. The thing that takes this out of the realm of maybe traditional Jungian work is that we take the imagination and we put it in action. And the embodied cognition part is when you reverse roles and you actually sit in the other chair, just like a terrific actor or actress would be trained, right? You embody the other role. It comes from game theory, role theory, this idea that when you take the other role, something happens to your brain and your body. And you take a minute to be in that benevolent self. And then you answer from that role. And what I can tell you from doing thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of these on my with other people, and certainly with myself, is you're often shocked at the answer.
Okay.
Because there's a benevolence with it, hence the name, that feels nurturing and supporting. It's never critical. I mean, if you sit in that role and it says, "Well, you shouldn't have done that," you're in the wrong role. It's very loving, very, and it says, something like, "I'm glad you're asking that question. It shows you're already on the right path." It has this warmth to it, but it also isn't afraid to give you some concrete information. Today's the day you got to clean out the closet, or today's the day you better get that paper done or something. And then you come back into your chair. So it's very simple, and sometimes I will tell you again, from doing probably tens of thousands of these at this point, because of the active imagination part, the speed of the drama is rather quick. It's very rare for it to last more than 5 minutes, because when your brain is functioning at that level, it already has anticipated the answers. on both, and the questions on both sides. So the enactment part of this is really giving life to it. And when that happens, it goes rather quickly. So usually there's 2 or 3 questions that I'll have. And then it's very, very satisfying. And always at the end, you end up back in your chair. That's really important. You must start in your chair and end in your chair. And always there's a thanks, a gratitude. And over time, you develop quite the relationship with this part of you.
Sounds really cool. I will try that out. I actually know this method from therapy, going into different chairs. But I will try that with like that people that appreciate me or that one like figure or energy and that supports me. And I will try that too. That's a very cool exercise. Thank you for sharing it. And it seems like, you don't need a lot of time. I think a lot of people always think, I don't have the time for things like that. But I think at the beginning, you only need a few minutes. And then after a while, you will enjoy the company so much and the talk probably.
Exactly right.
I take 10 minutes now.
Well, let me, if I could, I just want to capitalize on your thinking about that you said, though, you found this in therapy. What many people don't know, most people, including therapists, by the way, is where the origin of the empty chair came from. It came very specifically, and it's extremely well documented, from a man named Jacob Moreno. So if you've ever heard the term group therapy, that's the person who coined the term. And the term was coined in the early 30s. And it came directly from his work in psychodrama. And again, what most people don't know about Moreno is that he created a form of therapy and a method of therapy that used almost exclusively action. And that many forms of group therapy, things like Gestalt or those kind of things, were just derivatives. They took little bits and pieces of psychodrama. But Moreno was inspired by a spiritual awakening. He had a direct spiritual experience, and actually part of that spiritual experience was to do this method of therapy. So we're very close to the source when we're doing enactment and role playing, and so it's been watered down greatly. Things like Gestalt have taken aspects of it, things like when people use simulation and things like that. But if you go back to its core, it's really an amazing and powerful technique. And so that's the first part. The second part I want to say is that most of what I'll do with my students is talk about something known as dispositional mindfulness, which has to do with understanding how you're feeling in the moment, right? Like what you're feeling in the moment, rather than developing a sitting practice in meditation. I believe very much in that. I think that's good. But people say, I don't have 20 minutes. Well, you don't need 20 minutes. You need 3 seconds to have a dispositional mindset. What am I feeling right now? What strengths of mine are being used right now? What's happening to me in the moment? And in the moment, you're able to separate yourself from your experience to observe it. That moment is so precious in the development of this internal mechanism, and it only takes a few seconds. So I highly encourage people to do that too.
I think that's a part that's misunderstood in mindfulness also. Always people think mindfulness is like meditating for like 20 minutes, like you said. But it's more like being in the present, being in the here and now. And like you said, you can be that in any minute or any moment. You don't need to sit down to meditate, to be present. You can just be it right now. And that's much more easy.
I think Thich Nhat Hanh's original book released in the West, The Miracle of Mindfulness, really set the stage for that kind of understanding, because he said the Westerners pretty much got it wrong. Mindfulness isn't something you go do so that you can go do something else better. And in the West, we use meditation still, I think, as a means to an end. If you meditate, your blood pressure will get better. If you meditate, your relationships will get better. So we see it sort of like going to the gym, and the truth is, Thich Nhat Hanh's work, the Vietnamese Buddhist monk, said that the goal of life is to be mindful, and that when we're meditating, it's just a practice of what we should be doing all the time. And I think that was revolutionary. His book is classic now; it's probably 30 years old, but it really puts the idea that every moment is precious and sacred, and that when we're meditating, we're just trying to elevate that level that we should be doing all the time.
I love that. I really love that. It was like, for me right now, it was like, aha, that's so true. We're doing it to like get something else done, but it's more about being. And that's so true. Thank you for sharing that.
When I was first starting my practice and, working with people and trying to help them with interventions and stuff like that. And then Thich Nhat Hanh's book came out, and, so I was recommending it to everybody, oh, you got to read this book. And I'll never forget, there was a woman who came for therapy, and I recommended the book, and she came back the following week. She goes, I looked everywhere and I cannot find that book, The Miracle of Mindlessness. And I was like, well, that's not exactly the name.
Oh, that's very good. That's funny. So it's very cool for me to just talk about spirituality with you, and it seems so normal. What I experience in Germany, it's still like put into a woo-woo area, like it's kind of like woo-woo, and especially men don't want to identify with being a spiritual being. And still there's a lot of separation between science and spirituality. And I have the feeling it's different in the United States. It's much more normal to be spiritual and to have a spiritual practice. And what would you say? Like, how can you combine spirituality and like science and getting it out of that woo-woo corner?
Yeah, I will. I'm going to take a chance here and say something a little bold. The scientists or the people who have that opinion, while I understand that opinion very much, really just simply don't know the science. It's a position that is evolved based more on what they don't know than what they do know. Because the science around spiritual development, spirituality, neurochemistry, neurobiology is so robust and so intense and so well done that people just don't know about it. And it's all published in all the major journals, JAMA, all the well-being journals, positive psychology journals. I mean, it's some of the top journals in the world. But people often will have a filter on. And so if you are looking through the lens, if you have a dark yellow lens on, right, and something is clearly blue out there, and it's real and it's blue, but through your lens, you're going to see it as green. You're not going to see it for what it is. You're going to see it through a distortion. And so the courses I teach, the things I write about, the perspective that I come from is simplistic at one level and uses the best of our science at the other. The simple part is that nobody alive has ever created themselves. So we have to start there. You didn't create yourself. Some force much larger than you brought your consciousness into existence. And we still do not know how thoughts are formed.
Mhm.
We've put people on the moon, and we've done, sent stuff out at this. We don't know how a thought is formed.
Mhm.
So we have two incredibly powerful mysteries that there isn't a scientist. Doesn't matter if they've won a Nobel Prize, doesn't matter what they've done. There's no scientist that's been able to fully answer those questions. What are the forces that brought us into existence, right? And how do thoughts form? So if you start there, you recognize that the mystery is still very much in front of us. It's not, and you can't dismiss it. You can't just backhand it, and even if, you talk to some people like evolutionists or evolutionary psychology, and they say, oh, well, we came from this and that. Well, okay, all right. Where did the bacteria come from that landed on the earth? Did it come from inside the earth, or did it maybe come from, a piece of space that landed on the earth? So you start there. And then we move all the way up to the revolutionary work of Dr. Lisa Miller and The Awakened Brain, where she's been able to conclusively show the relationship of depression to spiritual awakening. That's why if you look at what has happened to most people who have had a spiritual experience, it often follows some difficulty in their life and something fairly profound. Um, and what we know is that it activates, it seems to awaken the brain when we've had a traumatic event or something very difficult, or what George Bonanno calls a potentially traumatic event. Because our notion of things like PTSD is way out of whack. We think everybody's traumatized. Well, no, the truth is everybody's quite resilient. And if you look at what happens in the brain, and you look at what happens with the activation of the brain to respond to a stimulus, you start to realize that there's amazing science. What Dr. Miller has shown is that the people who have had a depression, particularly adolescents, who have had a depression, and then a spiritual connection, a relationship with the transcendent, have a thickening in a section of their brain that has happened because of the spiritual awakening. And it becomes the most protective factor in their lives. Like if you have a relationship with the transcendent and you're an adolescent, you are better protected against things like risky behavior, drug abuse, suicide, conduct disorders. It just goes on and on. And so now psychologists can't avoid this because it's the best. And you can't just say, oh, spirituality is this fluffy stuff. No, it changes your brain. It's a protective factor, and it changes the trajectory and impact of your life at every level. So I think that's worthwhile.
Yeah, it resonates a lot with me because I told you I was in a burnout and then had a depressive episode with it. And I also think it awakened me, like spiritual. I was I think I was spiritual or religious when I was a child because I kind of grew up like this. Then I totally lost it, which probably brought me into depression and burnout. And then I developed, or I came back to that spiritual aspect of life, and mindfulness and meditating and finding something bigger. And it kind of saved me, or it gave me so much hope, so much optimism, so much strength and trust in me and in my life that I would really say, yes, it's very true from my experience. Yes.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I would have recovered that fast if I didn't have that aspect of spirituality in that time of my life.
You see, Ula, that is like the perfect story because the science would hallmark every layer of that development. Your story would be emblematic of the kind of changes we're talking about. And the fallacy is that it's a one-off. Like you think, oh, this just happened to me. Well, no. We've studied lots and lots of people, and we've studied like George Bonanno's work on resilience. He was a resilience researcher before 9/11, and then 9/11 happened literally just down the block. And when that happened, he had the perfect laboratory for studying human resilience. And so he created this idea known as a PTE, a potentially traumatic event. So now we have, again, Dr. Miller's work on what happens to your brain after a depression or a trauma, or it's like that. And it doesn't mean that the trauma is here to stay. It means that it has a potential to be traumatic, but how we view it has more value. It's not what happens to us, right? It's how we view what happens to us, right?
Yes, very much. That's so true. That's probably, people, when I was in that phase of my life, I met other people, and sometimes they didn't get out of depression for years.
Yep.
And because they were still like in that, this happened to me and this happened to me. And it was kind of like that when it happened to me, when I was in that depression. I always said, okay, what's the next one step that I can get out of this? I always look like ahead. Okay, what's one step today that I can do to get better? And I think if you stay in that state of I'm that victim now, and this happened to me, it's probably more difficult to get out of this, rather than like always looking forward to like, what's the next step? What can I do? How can I get better? And I think that's also a very good link to your book that I have here. And you can see, look how many marks it has when I read
Nicely done, Ola. Nicely done.
It's more green than anything else. Listeners can't see it, but there's a lot of like marks and things in the book now. It's pretty much also what you say in your book, right? It's called Learned Hopefulness, the Power of Positivity to Overcome Depression.
Yeah. Thank you. What a lovely segue that was. I feel very lucky. One of the things that just happened here in the United States is that it was identified as the best book for using positivity to overcome depression by the medical news journal. So this was very, very exciting to me because a few things have happened recently, and most of the new research is really new. It's within the last 5 years, and I've just been very lucky to either know or be in touch with some of the leading researchers doing the work. Everybody from Scott Barry Kaufman to Ryan Niemiec, and of course George Bonanno, Lisa Miller. So these researchers are sort of paving the way, and Marty Seligman had this amazing piece of research published with his research partner, Steve Mayer, and he invited about 40 of us to listen to this piece of research when it first came out. And I was very lucky again to be in that audience. And it's a 50-year follow-up to Learned Helplessness. So the original paradigm that changed the world's view of depression, that if you are exposed to a situation where you feel helpless, you'll get agitated, but after a while, you'll just give up. And then when placed in another environment where it would be easy for you to succeed, people don't respond. They learn to give up, right? And so this paradigm of learned helplessness swept the world. I think their original book was in, I don't know, every language. And so the scientists jumped on board because it was a beautiful paradigm. But a few years ago, Marty wrote some follow-up research along with Steve Mayer, who had become a neuroscientist along the way. And what they found is that they were completely wrong about this. And most scientists haven't learned about this yet, so because it's new. but they found out they were completely wrong, because back in the 60s, when they were doing the research, they didn't have access to fMRIs and what's going on in the brain. They didn't know what was happening. So they had to make a hypothesis about, oh, if you learn to be helpless in this situation, it would cause helplessness in that situation. But now that we have fMRIs, we know what's going on. And what they found out is that if you're exposed to a chronically aversive stimulus, an evolutionary loop happens. It's just like your cell phone or your computer. If you overheat, right, you'll shut down. So there was nothing being learned, which is fascinating. It means if you're in a chronically aversive situation, your brain will shut down. And it's doing it for the same reason your computer or your cell phone shuts down. It shuts down to conserve your energy. Okay. Because if your assessment, your risk assessment is that no matter what I do, I'm going to waste a lot of energy and I'm not going to change the circumstance, let me shut down, save my energy until my assessment of the situation changes. Mm-hmm. Just like your computer, it'll shut down and wait until it's cooler to turn back on. Same thing with your cell phone. We do the same thing. So it's an evolutionary switch in the brain through the something known as the dorsal raphe nucleus and the prefrontal cortex that shifts this from what's happening to your risk assessment of what might be possible. So if the risk assessment is, no, it's still too hot out there, not going to turn back on, you won't. But if the risk assessment is, no, things are better than they were before, you get activated. And curiously enough, certainly for me sitting in that lecture, they called the loop in the brain that does that, the hope circuit. And I remember almost running out of the classroom to write down the ideas for the book, Learned Hopefulness. And of course, because they had learned helplessness, I asked Marty, I said, you okay with this? He was like, yes, of course, and he endorsed the book. So it's this idea that we don't learn to be helpless. We make an assessment about our situation in the future if we can control it in some way, influence it in some way. And that means that their original theory was as wrong could be, because it's not about the past, it's about the future.
That's so interesting. And I think that's one of the most important points in all this, because when it comes to depression or mental illness or whatever, it's always about the past usually.
Absolutely. And right.
About the future. I really like that a lot.
Yeah. It's a powerful way to help people understand and use science. Mm-hmm. Because the whole book, Learned Hopefulness, is pure science applied. So if you notice, I have many interventions in there to help people shift their brain and shift their perspective and shift the lens they look at life through. But it's all based on really solid, well-established research, because each element of it is prospective. So instead of it being retrospective or reactive, it's proactive. And once you make that shift, you start to find ways to, first of all, feel better about your life, feel better in the moment, and then start making better risk assessments of what you can and can't do. And that's not random. I have something called the 21-Day Hope Challenge, where I do 7 interventions about how to change your past, 7 interventions about changing your present, and 7 interventions about the future. But this Hope Challenge allows people to learn, well, you can't change what happened in the past, but you can change how you look at it. So one of the simple exercises is I ask people to write down everything they did yesterday. I give them 1 minute to write down everything they do. And they 1 minute, they write it all down. And then I say, now I want you to look at yesterday through the lens of gratitude and find 3 things that you have gratitude for that happened yesterday. and write them down and elaborate. What made you have gratitude for them? And then I ask people to compare the two lists. And unless people have a practice of gratitude, the information that shows up on the second list doesn't always show up on the first list, because when the brain is just functioning in that moment to moment way, it's not looking for good stuff. It's just looking for stuff. The good stuff doesn't bubble to the surface. But when you change your lens and start to look for the good, you find it.
Yeah, that's true. That's so true. That's a very powerful exercise. And actually, that's what I really loved about the book. It's not just something you read. It's not just theoretical. You can practice it. You can do something every day and like step by step. So I really, really like that, because there's so many interventions and exercises included. And I actually did them along the way while reading it. And it's very cool. And what I thought was, well, for the audience, I think we have to say one thing about hopefulness. It always means that something negative had to be before that. Is it right that you only can be hopeful if there's something negative, or if you're in a negative state, right?
Yeah. You did read the book. I'm very impressed. Yeah. Well, I start the book with this idea that hope is really unique about all the positive emotions, because it's the only positive emotion that requires negativity or uncertainty to be activated. And actually, the Greek mythology, if you go all the way back to Pandora, right? Pandora's box, right? And she opens up the box and all the evils in the world are let out. But one thing doesn't come out of the box. She closes it to keep it inside, and that's hope. So it's interesting if you look at mythology, where that came from, right? Because it means that hope lived with all of that negativity and all of those disappointments, because it needed to know it intimately. And then it was kept in the jar because it's the secret weapon. It knows every single one of those negative elements intimately. So when we are employing hope, if you weren't negative or uncertain, there'd be no need for hope, right? because right, yeah. But once you know that negativity and uncertainty are necessary activators, that they are, there's a saying in Buddhism, no mud, no lotus. Right. Where do you get the nutrients from? The mud. Where do you get sustainability from? The mud. And once you appreciate that principle is alive and well with hope, it changes things. And quite honestly, hope theory, hope measures, and everything else kind of came to a screeching halt about 10 years ago, because major researchers in that area passed away. And, so there's a time for renaissance now. I'm working with a team of researchers around the globe to help revolutionize the measure of hope, the understanding of it, the use of it. And my job in that is to really add the practical or the applied part. And that's what the book Learned Hopefulness is about.
A lot, yes. So what I thought when I read it was like these exercises or these interventions are not only helpful once you're in a depression. I also thought it's very helpful to do it on the way, because we all experience something negative in our everyday life. And I think you could use these interventions to prevent going into a depression long term. Would you also say that's true?
Absolutely. Again, in the very beginning of the book, I start with some dire statistics, and that was all pre-COVID. My book got released last June, right smack in the middle of COVID, right, in June of 2020. And the thing that has been most devastating is to realize that the statistics that I based the book on have all gotten worse since COVID. And at that time, before COVID, the number one statistic I had is that 80% of people with depression relapse. Now that's actually a very conservative figure, because what we now know is that if you've relapsed 3 times with depression, your chances of relapsing again is 100%. So psychology as a science has failed miserably, really miserably, for a variety of different reasons in combating depression. Because between the medicine, the research, the interventions, it just hasn't worked. Imagine if I owned a business where 80% of the product failed. I wouldn't be in business anymore. So we have to learn not from the 80% that failed, but the 20% that succeeded. And what we've learned there is that once people get out of a depression, they're using tools to stay out. And the history of psychology has only been on alleviating suffering. And there's nothing wrong with alleviating suffering, but if that's all you do, you're setting yourself up for a continual relapse, because you get out and then you go back in, you get out and go back in. So we start studying the people who are resilient, people who are hopeful, people who've learned to use positive emotions as a way to not only get out of a bad space, but then sustainably stay out. And there, again, one of the sayings I have in the book, that I use as my mantra, not being depressed isn't the same as being happy.
Yeah.
So if science has gotten you out of depression, that's not good enough.
Yeah.
It doesn't really help. First of all, because it's momentary and people relapse. And we've only looked at alleviating the pain. We haven't looked at sustainability. And that's the difference, by the way, in medicine. I teach now, I do courses on what's known as positive medicine, speak on that, because one of the things that's happened is that medicine kind of set the tone for just healing, and alleviating suffering. They really didn't do anything. And, if you take a look at statistics around the world with modern medicine, what you find out is, as an example, the United States is 17th out of 17 countries, the top countries in medicine, because we don't have anything about helping patients have more positive affect and wellness afterwards. So our numbers are miserable because they're only focusing on alleviating the pain, curing that, but there's nothing for the follow-up. And I think that's going to be a new and very exciting science going forward.
Absolutely. It's not like really curing something. It's more about getting the symptoms away without really getting to the cause of this. So what did you find out so far about the factors of staying out of depression? So what are important factors that people don't relapse back?
What a great question. The number one thing is to find out what it is that you can control in your future. And very often what happens is that people will set a goal. And if their goal gets missed or crushed, what happens is they stay despondent, they stay depressed. So there's several stories, but one of my favorite ones is a woman who worked in a bookstore and had a very thriving career. She loved it. She had retired into that and just absolutely loved working there. And then she got cancer and wasn't able to work. The treatments were quite overwhelming for her and took her energy. So she had to stop working, and then was actually very depressed because she lost her role. It wasn't just the cancer, was the fact that now she couldn't do the things that really brought her joy. And I was seeing her for the depression. And one of the things we did is shifted her goal, to make it much more tangible. And we use this thing I read about in the book called micro goals, right? Where, okay, a micro goal is very, very, very tiny compared to what you are hoping for, but it's more immediate. So we picked one day a week where she could go back to work for 1 hour as a relief person for lunch for somebody else. Well, the moment we did that, she went back, everything got better. She felt better about it. She couldn't wait for the next week. And then once her treatments improved and she improved a bit, then we did it 2 days a week. And you know where this story is going, right? Yeah. Where eventually she was able to replace 1 hour a day, and she looked forward to that tremendously. Eventually, then she came back part-time, and then eventually full-time as her treatment happened. But the thing that gave her hope was setting a goal that was attainable. And had that sense of she could have enough energy to invest in that. And the principles around that are the things that really make for change. So the thing I'd highly encourage people to do is set micro goals. What can you do in the next 20 minutes? Not what you're going to do 3 months from now. Well, what are you going to do in the next 20 minutes for preparing lunch, for returning 2 emails, for making a phone call? What my day is filled with dozens and dozens and dozens of micro goals. All moving forward, but it gives you that feedback, that sense of accomplishment and positivity that keeps you motivated.
Yeah, that sounds really good. Yeah, it's like little steps. I always sometimes I say my clients, like my coaches, just like, what can you do that brings you 1% closer to what you want? Yeah. Just 1%, not go 1%. For 100%, 1% every day, 1%.
Exactly.
So you already mentioned COVID, and that probably depression rates and anxiety and things got worse than we know by now. And what I really miss, everything I've learned about positive psychology, every day I ask myself, like, why is this not used? Why is this not used from experts, from politicians, in media? Why are they not encouraging people to stay hopeful, to be grateful, to encourage these positive emotions? In Germany, it's a lot of anxiety, and you have to panic and you have to be afraid, and people are very in that state of anxiety and fear right now. Wouldn't you think also that it would be helpful to implement more hopefulness into people to get over this time?
Oh, of course. But I'm also very realistic. When a new batch of science comes along, doesn't matter if it's technology or medicine or psychology or even chemistry, it doesn't matter. When something new comes along that's real and viable, it takes about 20 years for it to be fully accepted. And for people, and we're just at that point now with positive psychology, that now universities are having, undergraduate courses, graduate courses, master's degrees in it. There's even a Ph.D. in it now because it's become more and more and more and more accepted. And so what happens is you also get a lot of people who jump on the bandwagon who don't really have. They might have read a book or two. They don't have a lot of expertise. So what happens is they'll be promoting, think happy thoughts. But then as soon as they run into an area where they don't know how to navigate something, now it generates this idea, see, happy things don't work. So my encouragement is always for people to learn more. If you haven't read Marty Seligman's book on flourishing, that's seminal work, because he really is the father of positive psychology. If you haven't read Csikszentmihalyi's book on flow, to really avail yourself of that. If you haven't read Lisa Miller's work on the awakened brain and the spiritual child. These are preeminent scientists that are showing the way. And George Bonanno's new book on the end of trauma. These are people who are the scientists that are guiding us. And then, there's a lot of practical applications. So Tayyab Rashid does positive psychotherapy. There's Chivas does hope therapy. And my stuff is folded in there in terms of practical applications of hopefulness. So it's the idea of just keep learning. The science is new. Find the books that speak to it. See what the experts are talking about. And keep learning, because I think where Barbara Fredrickson's work on positivity just revolutionary.
I love it. Yeah, that's one of my favorite topics from positive psychology is her work on the positive emotions and love and the upward spiral. That's wow.
Right. And Sonia Lubomirsky's work, and so you have people doing the research. The degree to which that research has to become more applied is where all the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology programs are coming from. And you need people to translate it. One of the pieces of research that I've been immersed in is that when researchers do the work, there's a built-in type of bias that affects all of science. That, first of all, there's something known as a publication bias, which basically means it's only the stuff that works out that gets published, right? That's and so a lot of things that might be good ideas that just didn't make the criteria for a journal get lost in the sauce, when the truth is there's a lot of good stuff that just needs to be tweaked. The other thing too is many of the great researchers are tethered to an academic institution. So they have an academic mindset. And while that's certainly important and helpful, it means that they're going to kind of fall in line with the kind of research that gets published, and gets done in that way, and not necessarily applied. So as an example, there's about 1 billion people on the planet who can't read. They either have low literacy or no literacy. And there had been no research at all in positive psychology for that population. And arguably, the people who have the greatest trauma risk and lowest cognitive ability to deal with that threshold. So I work now with lots of groups who are taking that research, and part of my job is how do you convert that to something that maybe doesn't use reading and writing, maybe doesn't use because if you take a look at all the positive interventions, a lot of it has to do with taking scales or measuring this way or writing letters or this and that. And the truth is, that's only one vehicle. I think there's lots of ways, and honestly, in my own bias, maybe better ways. The embodied cognition came directly from that research. If you tell somebody to go write a letter, that's great. But if they can't write or read, that's not the way to go. Is there another way to deliver? So like the virtual gratitude visit is something that I've done a lot of work on, a lot of research on, where we do that role playing, where people deliver an expression of gratitude to an empty chair. No reading, no writing. And we can do that with people who have had dual diagnosis, intellectual and psychiatric disability. Do it with people who don't have full literacy. And we find that it works extremely well with people who are highly literate, very intelligent, because it cuts through and gets to the emotion. So I just think that it's an exciting science, and we're on the verge.
Okay. Sounds very good. So, what I until all these positive psychology interventions are on the media and on the news, what can people do in their everyday life? Like if somebody feels I'm affected by the pandemic and I don't feel so good anymore, what's little things everybody can do just to practice positive psychology in an everyday life for themselves?
I would recommend four things that all come through from the research and are we know that they will work, right? And so I recommend you do these four things, but I also say that there's many more, but these four seem to be, I in the work on hopefulness, we've studied people with low hope and high hope. And the people with high hope, there are 7 decisions that high hope people make. And so some of what I'm about to say come from understanding what those decisions are, right? So these 4 things are pretty straightforward. The first one is every other day to do a gratitude review. And what that means is you take 2 minutes in the morning or 2 minutes before you go to bed, and you, in the beginning, write down 3 things you have gratitude for that happened within the last 24 hours. Now, I say every other day because the research showed that if you did it every day, you run into something known as gratitude fatigue. So quite honestly, what I do is I try to do it every day, and I know I'm going to miss a few days, and 3 or 4 days a week will happen. But that is essential because you realize how much good has already happened in your life. So identifying those 3 things would be essential. The second thing I would say is to use micro goals. And that is very short, 15, 20, 30 minutes top. What can I get done in the next, couple of minutes? And it could be anything from making lunch to answering emails to writing 200 words to cleaning out your closet. But have an intentional set for a micro goal. And that seems to help people feel really engaged. And then, one of the things about hope is that it's bi-directional. That if you start with just a little tiny bit of positive feeling and you put it out into the world and the world changes because you have a little control over it, it gives you back a positive feeling that fuels your engagement with the next thing. So micro goals are a way to really build that. The third thing is about pick one day a week to do 5 acts of kindness. And like my day is Thursday. So that doesn't mean if I'm walking down the street and you drop a book in front of me and it's a Wednesday, I say, oh man, what a shame. I I could have, if it was just one more day, I could have helped you with it. It doesn't mean you can't be kind on other days, but if you pick one day a week to do 5 acts of kindness, again, from the research, it shows that it really improves your way of thinking. And it could be doing acts of kindness or spotting acts of kindness, so it's either way. And then the final thing I'll say is to cherish your relationships. That if I want to know how long you're going to live and how well, all I have to do is take a look at the quality of your relationships. And that, so I would really say that is right at the core of this. If you have friendships, you invest in them, meeting new people and invest in that. And of course, your intimate relationships, pay a great deal of attention to those, because that's going to tell us a lot about not only who you are now, but how well you're going to be in the future.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's 4 very, very good tips. And I'm a really big fan of gratitude, and I love that. And with the kindness, I will try that. I will pick out a day, and I think maybe it's not even just kindness towards other people, maybe always kindness to ourselves. Like, what is something kind I can do for myself or to myself? Make
Absolutely.
myself a compliment or something like that. And
Yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah,
very
yeah.
cool.
Yeah, yeah. So we, again, this idea of the 21-day hope challenge, where we do something about the past, something about the present, something about the future. These are all geared to that. The gratitude is about the past. The kindness is certainly about the present, as is the relationship stuff, and the micro goals are about the future. So once you start thinking in that way, that you can have interventions that change the lens through which you look at life, it improves everything.
Can anybody enroll in that 21-day challenge?
Yeah,
Like
uh,
online?
yeah, right now, if you go to my website and you just sign up, you can get a couple of chapters from the book, so people who sign up can get that. And then what happens is we will have launch dates in January. I'm sorry, in 2022. That will I'll let people know about that. Right now, I'm doing it for different entities that have contracted for it. So if I do some work for business, I have it, but it's all ready to go, and I'll have an announcement about that later in the year.
Cool. I will put all that in the show notes, like where people can access your website and your book, and I will also put your book in the show notes. I think right now it's not translated into German yet, but
Not yet. Yeah. We can be hopeful. We're hopeful that
hopeful that this is
Hopeful.
going to happen. Though I think I have to say, I think it's also easy to read for Germans. If they speak English, they will be very fine in understanding this book. The language is very good to understand. So I really want to encourage everybody. If you could listen to us now and you kind of understood what we talked about, you will be able to read that book. So I recommend it, and I will put it in the show notes also. And maybe some of the other books you mentioned, like the work from Lisa Miller, for example, I will put some of the other books that you mentioned also in the show notes, so people can find out more about this if they're interested in it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Dan, I thank you so much for being here. This was more than an hour that we already talked, and we could probably go on for
on and on. Yeah,
so
sure.
interesting. Well, people don't know, I haven't mentioned this yet. I met you through a lecture from my studies of positive psychology. You were there as a guest lecturer, and this was the first one, actually. And I was like sitting there, I was like, oh my God, I want to listen to him all day long, because I had so many aha moments.
That's so nice. Thank you for saying so. Thank you.
Thank you for all your work that you're doing. I think we really, really need this. The world really needs this. So thank you very much for doing what you're doing. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk here with me and to be here. And maybe one day we'll meet in New York City.
That'd be great. That'd be fantastic. Fantastic. That'd be great.
Thank you, Dan. And
thank you, Ula. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as I did, and I will put everything in the show notes, how you can find Dan. And please give us some feedback. If you have questions, write me an email and to info@ulagoldberg.com, or you can leave us a comment under the posts on Instagram and Facebook today. And I'm looking forward to next time here on Feel Inside Yourself.